The stage station sat alone against the endless sweep of desert, its rough timber walls silvered by the sun and scarred by years of wind-blown grit. A battered sign swung lazily above the doorway, the letters so faded that only a traveler who already knew what it said could make it out. Dust lay heavy over the porch boards, and the only sound came from the flies buzzing around a trough where a mule half dozed, its ribs stark under its hide. This was no bustling outpost of civilization, but one of the countless forgotten way stations that dotted the frontier of place meant only to keep travelers alive until they could move on. Inside, the air was close with the smell of leather, dried beans, and stale tobacco. A few men slouched in the shadowy corners, waiting for the next coach that might not come until evening. Their clothes were trail-worn, their faces drawn tight from weeks under the sun. Nobody spoke much. Out here, words were spent as sparingly. As water dot among them sat Clara Hastings, the only woman in sight. She had chosen a seat near the small, cracked window where she could look out across the barren land. Her hands, folded in her lap, gripped the fabric of her plain traveling dress as though it alone could anchor her in this strange, shifting moment of her life. She was young no more than 25, but hardship had carved lines of quiet endurance into her features. Clara's story was not unusual for the frontier. 2 years earlier, she had been a wife, keeping house with her husband on a claim near the Arkansas River. They had dreamed, like so many settlers, of fertile fields and a future built with their own hands. But the dream had soured. Fever had taken him first, and the farm had withered soon after. Clara had sold what little she could, packed the rest into a trunk, and now sat at the edge of nowhere, waiting for the stagecoach that would carry her westward to New Mexico, where a cousin had promised her work and shelter. Still, as she sat there, Clara was painfully aware of her isolation. The men in the station cast glances at her now and again, curious, sometimes sympathetic, sometimes sharp with the hunger of long solitude, but none dared speak. She kept her gaze steady out the window, her posture straight, giving off an air of self-possession that discouraged intrusion. She had learned quickly that in places like this, strength was as much a performance as a reality. Outside, the sun climbed higher, pressing heat down upon the roof until the boards creaked. The horizon shimmered, a wavering line between earth and sky. Now and again, a vulture circled lazily above, as though it knew better than the men how fragile human lives were out here. The station master, a thin fellow with whiskers too patchy to command respect, shuffled in and out, occasionally announcing that the coach was running a little behind. No one complained. Delays were expected. Out here, time stretched in peculiar ways, measured not by clocks, but by distance and survival. Clara let her thoughts drift while the silence pressed close. She wondered whether she would ever feel at home again, or if she was destined always to be a guest, moving from one place to another. The landscape beyond the window offered no answer. It seemed endless, merciless, and yet it stirred something in her, some mixture of dread and possibility. What she did not know, what none of them knew, was that this day would not pass in quiet waiting. The horizon that shimmered so peacefully was already hiding the dust of a rider who would arrive before the coach, a rider whose presence would alter the course of her life forever. But in that moment, Clara only sat quietly at the lonely station, a figure of solitude against the immensity of the west. The stillness of the afternoon broke first as a murmur, a sound just at the edge of hearing. At first, Clara thought it was the wind tugging over the plains or the clatter of a distant wagon wheel, but no wagon appeared on the sunlit horizon. Instead, the sound deepened into a rhythmic pounding, the unmistakable cadence of hooves. The waiting men stirred uneasily. They rose from their chairs, drifting toward the doorway like hounds catching a scent they did not trust. Even the mule outside flicked its ears, lifting its head to peer across the flat expanse. The stagecoach was expected, but not from this direction, and not with this single steady thunder. Clara leaned forward at the window, her brow furrowing. In the wavering heat shimmer she caught a figure first no more than a blur, then sharp against the horizon. A rider, alone. He did not carry himself like a courier or a farmer, but with an unhurried certainty as though the land itself belonged to him. Dust billowed up beneath the hooves of his horse, a great animal dark with sweat and power. The rider sat barebacked, not slouched in weariness but upright, a spear in his hand and long hair streaming in the wind. As he drew closer, the glint of the sun flashed off a necklace of bone and silver at his chest. His body was massive, his shoulders filling the sky behind him, and his skin was the copper of the earth itself. The station grew hushed, each man holding his breath. Clara felt a chill pass through her despite the burning heat. She had heard the stories whispered over fires and in hushed tones in towns tales of Apache warriors, fierce and unyielding, lords of these deserts that white settlers thought they could tame. The sight of this man, flesh and blood before her, made those stories suddenly real. The rider slowed as he reached the station yard, his horses breathing loud in the quiet. He reined the beast with a casual hand and sat still, his dark eyes sweeping over the building, over the men gathered at the door, and then landing, unblinking, on Clara herself. She froze. Something in that gaze was heavy, ancient, and utterly sure of itself. The men around her shifted, their hands twitching near the butts of pistols, yet none dared raise a weapon. They were cowards, perhaps, or wise. Clara could not tell which, but she knew instinctively that if a shot were fired, blood would stain the sand in an instant. The Apache dismounted in one fluid motion, his boots hitting the earth with a dull thud. Up close, he seemed larger still, his presence filling the space like a storm. He spoke then, his voice low and resonant, carrying the authority of a man used to command. You. The single word hung in the air like a challenge. Clara's heart jolted, her lips parting, though no sound escaped. He pointed toward her, his expression unreadable. Then, in words more clear, he declared, "You're coming with me." A stunned silence followed. Clara heard her own heartbeat hammering in her ears. The other men looked away, avoiding her eyes, unwilling to step between her and this giant who had walked out of the horizon. The station master sputtered, but his protest died in his throat when the Apache turned his gaze upon him. In that moment, Clara understood that the world she had known, the widow's grief, the patient waiting for the coach, the half-formed hope of a new life in New Mexico was dissolving like dust on the wind. Something greater and far more dangerous had stepped into her path. The rider was not the stagecoach she had waited for, yet he was here, and he had chosen her. The air inside the station seemed to thin, as though the single word had sucked the breath out of every chest. "You're coming with me." The phrase lingered, impossible to mistake, spoken with the calm certainty of a man who did not ask but simply declared what would be. Clara felt every eye in the room flicker toward her, though not one pair lingered for long. The settlers hunched their shoulders, shifting like guilty men caught in a storm. Not one of them moved to step between her and the towering Apache who now stood framed in the doorway. She swallowed, her throat dry as the desert. "No," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "You're mistaken. I'm waiting for the coach." The Apache's dark gaze never wavered. He took a step forward, and the wooden floor creaked beneath his weight. The men shuffled back, instinctively giving him a wide berth. He pointed again, this time more deliberate, his long arm extended, his hand as steady as stone. "You?" he repeated, his tone brooking no argument. "You come." The station master licked his lips, glancing nervously between Clara and the warrior. His thin voice squeaked out, Now see here. This ain't proper business. Ladies waiting on the stage, sir." The Apache turned his head slowly, fixing the little man with eyes that held neither anger nor mercy, only absolute power. The station master faltered, stammered once more, and then fell silent, retreating behind the counter like a mouse backing into its hole. Clara's pulse quickened. She forced herself to stand, her hands gripping the back of her chair to keep them from trembling. "I don't belong to you," she said, louder this time, though she could hear the edge of fear in her own words. "I am a free woman, and I won't be taken." The Apache listened, his face unreadable. Then, as if her defiance amused him, the corner of his mouth twitched in something that might have been a smile, but it was not one of kindness. "Strong," he said softly, his English accented but clear. "You live, others die." He gestured vaguely toward the horizon, toward the countless graves of settlers swallowed by fever, thirst, or the desert itself. His meaning was plain. She had endured where many had not. And in his eyes that made her his choice, a murmur ran through the watching men. One reached for the butt of his revolver, but his hand froze when the Apache's gaze snapped toward him, like a hawk striking. The man looked away, suddenly fascinated by the floorboards. Clara's chest tightened. She realized then that no one would intervene. These men, rough as they were, wanted no quarrel with a warrior who radiated danger as naturally as the sun radiated heat. Whatever happened, she would face it alone. The Apache moved closer, his shadow falling over her. Clara tilted her chin upward, refusing to shrink, though every instinct urged her to step back. His height dwarfed her, his presence pressing down, like the weight of a mountain. "You come," he said again, slower this time, as though sealing the words into fate. "With me," her breath caught. The words weren't a threat. They were a vow. And though her heart hammered with fear, another sensation crept beneath it, something she could not name, born of the certainty in his voice and the unwavering steadiness of his eyes. In that moment, Clara Hastings, widow and wanderer, understood that her life no longer followed her own design. It had been claimed, as surely as land is claimed with a stake in the earth. Clara's refusal still lingered in the air, but the Apache warrior had already decided. His eyes told her that. They were not cruel, not wild, not even impatient, just certain, as though the earth itself had spoken to him and he was carrying out its will. When he stepped forward again, the room seemed to shrink. The men nearest the wall pressed themselves back against it, hands limp at their sides, unwilling to risk what might happen if they interfered. Clara's heart pounded as she took a step back, her fingers brushing the edge of the table for balance. "Don't," she warned, her voice cracking now despite her effort. "Stay back." But he did in single quotes T. with a movement so swift it startled her. He reached out and seized her wrist. His grip was unbreakable, though not crushing. Clara struggled, twisting, striking out with her free hand. But he caught that one too with a precision that suggested he'd subdued resistance more times than she could imagine. "Let me go," she cried, her voice high, edged with panic. He said nothing. Instead, he lifted her bodily as if she weighed no more than a sack of grain. Gasps filled the room, but still none of the men moved. They stared, some ashamed, some relieved it was not their fate. All unwilling to challenge him. Clara kicked, her shoes striking against his legs, but he only adjusted his hold, one arm clamping around her waist, the other steadying her shoulders. Carried against his chest, she could feel the raw strength in him, the solidity of a man honed by hardship and wilderness. Against such power, her struggles seemed futile, but she fought all the harder for the principle of it. The station master's voice piped up weakly. Now, sir. Please, she's a lady." The Apache cut him a look, and the man's words collapsed into silence. The only sound was the rasp of Clara's breath, her fists beating uselessly against her captor's chest. He strode out of the station as though no one else existed. The sunlight struck them both, blinding Clara for a moment. She blinked furiously, her mind spinning. Beyond them, his horse waited, pawing the ground as if it too shared his resolve. "No!" she screamed, thrashing again, her hair coming loose in the dry wind. "You can't do this. Someone stop him." But no one did. The others remained on the porch, their faces pale, their mouths shut tight. A few turned away, pretending to be busy with nothing at all. The warrior swung her up onto the horse with an ease that made her gasp. She landed astride in front of him, his arm a band across her middle, holding her firmly in place. She tried to scramble down, but he gathered the reins, drew her back against him, and with a wordless command sent the horse forward. The animal leapt into motion, surging across the hard-packed earth, and the station fell behind them in a blur of dust and silence. Clara twisted, looking back over her shoulder, hoping against hope that one man, just one, would raise his gun or give chase. None did. The lonely outpost dwindled in the distance, a speck against the desert's vastness, and with it went the last connection to the world she had known. Clara felt the hot wind sting her eyes. She fought to steady her breath, to swallow her fear. Her body trembled against the unyielding wall of his chest, but inside, her spirit clung fiercely to a single thought. This is not the end of me. He may have taken me, but he does not own. I may. Not yet. The warrior said nothing as they rode. His silence was heavier than words, a silence that promised she had crossed an unseen boundary, one from which there would be no return. The desert opened before them like a vast, unbroken sea of stone and sun. The horses' hooves struck a steady rhythm against the baked earth, each beat carrying Clara farther from the life she had known. Dust rose in pale clouds around them, stinging her eyes and clinging to her lips, until even the taste of her fear was mixed with grit. Pressed tight against the Apache's chest, Clara tried to measure her breathing, tried to think. Every muscle in her body ached from resisting, yet his arm never loosened. It was not a grip of cruelty. He did not strike her or bind her, but it was a grip that told her escape was impossible. His strength was a wall, and she was caught inside. The land itself seemed to conspire with him. The station and its few sorry inhabitants had vanished behind them, swallowed by the shimmering horizon. Ahead stretched nothing but jagged mesas, red canyons, and the pale sweep of desert grass waving in the wind. Clara realized quickly that even if she broke free, even if she leapt from the horse and fled, the land would kill her before freedom could. She did not know where water lay hidden, nor which paths led to shelter. He did. Still, her pride burned hot. She clenched her jaw and asked, her voice hoarse from dust, "Where are you taking me?" For a long time, he did not answer. She wondered if he had even understood her words. But then, in his deep, measured tone, he said simply, "Home." The word struck her like a stone. Home. For her, that word meant a clapboard house on a farm. Long lost, a hearth gone cold, a husband buried in the earth. For him, it meant something entirely different, a place she could not imagine and had never been invited to. Her chest tightened. "I don't belong with you." Again, silence. He did not argue, nor did he release her. The horse carried them steadily onward, muscles rippling beneath its sleek hide. Clara realized with dawning unease that her protests mattered little to him. He had chosen, and in his world, perhaps choice was not a matter for both parties to share. As the sun began to tilt westward, the desert revealed more of its hidden self. They passed narrow gullies where cool shadows clung, arroyos carved deep by rains long gone, and stands of mesquite that offered brief, spiny cover. Once, far in the distance, Clara spotted a line of deer moving across a ridge. The land was not empty, only vast, its life subtle, invisible unless you knew how to see it. Her captor knew. Twice he slowed the horse to dismount briefly, scanning the ground with eyes as sharp as a hawk's. Once he stooped to pick up a pebble, rolling it in his palm before discarding it with quiet certainty. Tracking, she realized, reading the land. Every gesture told her this wilderness was not hostile to him. It was his ally. His language. Clara clung to the saddle horn, watching his profile as the wind whipped his long hair back. He was silent, as implacable as the mesas looming in the distance. She hated the certainty he carried, hated that she could not rattle him with words or struggles. Yet beneath the fear, another feeling took root, awe. The wildness around them was terrifying. Yes, but it was also magnificent. For the first time since leaving the station, Clara felt the raw immensity of the land pressing against her, vast and unyielding. And she realized with a chill that this was the world he meant to draw her into. As twilight painted the horizon in shades of fire, the Apache finally spoke again. "Tonight," he said, nodding toward the distance, "we camp." Clara turned, her head following his gaze. She saw nothing but rock and brush, but she knew he had already chosen the place. A new dread settled in her stomach. She was no longer being taken. She was being carried deeper into a world that would not let her go. By the second day of riding, Clara's body ached from the relentless pace. Her legs were stiff, her back sore, her throat raw from the desert air. She had lost track of direction. Hours ago, the sun wheeled overhead, merciless, while the land folded in upon itself with ridges, ravines, and hidden valleys that all looked alike to her untrained eye. Her captor, however, rode with the assurance of a man following a map written on the earth itself. At times he dismounted, leading the horse along narrow paths that seemed to vanish into sheer rock walls only to open into winding trails and secret passes. Clara began to understand that this wilderness held mysteries she could never uncover. On her own. When at last the horizon split to reveal a canyon mouth, her pulse quickened. The walls rose in jagged steps of red stone, streaked with shadow and golden light. They entered single file, the horses' hooves echoing against the cliffs. The air cooler here than in the open plains. Clara's heart thudded in her chest. She had no illusions. This was no casual stop. This was where he meant to bring her. As they rounded a bend, the canyon widened into a basin. There, spread across the sheltered ground, was a village Apache. Lodges of poles and hides, fires sending thin trails of smoke into the blue sky. Children darted between the shelters, women bent over grinding stones, men moved with quiet purpose. The place was alive with movement and sound, a thriving pulse hidden in the heart of the desert. Clara's breath caught. She had imagined something smaller, harsher, an outlaw's hideaway. Instead, she saw a community, a people bound together by a rhythm older than her own world. The smell of roasting meat drifted on the air, mingling with wood smoke and the scent of dust. Heads turned at their arrival. Conversations faltered. The children stopped in their play, eyes wide at the sight of the massive warrior riding in with a pale-skinned woman seated before him. Murmurs rippled through the camp, voices low but urgent. Clara's cheeks burned. She felt the weight of every stare pressing into her, stripping her bare. The warrior dismounted first, then lifted her down with effortless strength. She wrenched against his hold, but his grip was steady, guiding her to the ground rather than forcing her. He released her at once, and for the first time since the station, Clara found her feet beneath her, though they felt weak, unsteady. She looked around, aware of how utterly foreign she appeared here. Her dress, once practical traveling clothes, looked absurd against the earth tones of the Apache garments. Her hair, tangled and windblown, spilled loose from its pins. She wanted desperately to stand tall, to appear unafraid. But the strangeness of it all pressed down on her shoulders. An older woman approached, her dark eyes sharp as flint. She exchanged a look with the warrior, words unspoken but clearly understood. Then her gaze swept over Clara, appraising, measuring. Clara swallowed hard, resisting the urge to step back. The warrior finally spoke, his voice carrying across the camp. Though she did not understand the Apache words, their meaning was clear enough. He had brought someone of consequence. Clara saw the ripple of reaction, some nods, some frowns, some faces set in disapproval. The children crept closer, curious, whispering to one another. Clara met their stares, her heart beating fast. For the first time since being taken, she realized that she was no longer simply a captive of one man. She had been delivered into the heart of an entire people. The canyon walls rose high around them, sealing off escape. Clara felt it keenly, like a cage built of stone. Yet within that cage was life, vigorous, self-assured, and strange. She stood at its threshold, an outsider thrust into its midst, her future bound to the will of the man who had claimed her. As the camp absorbed her presence, Clara whispered to herself, low enough that none could hear, God help me. I don't belong here. But deep inside, a flicker of something else stirred, a curiosity she could not smother even in her fear. The first night in the Apache camp was long, restless, and cold despite the fire built for her. Clara sat cross-legged on a woven mat, her arms wrapped around her knees, listening to the sounds of the village. Laughter drifted from one fire, the steady beat of a drum from another. Children chattered until their mothers hushed them into sleep. Somewhere a coyote yipped at the moon, and the camp answered with silence. As though acknowledging a fellow wanderer, Clara felt none of that belonging. She sat apart, her pale face catching firelight, her eyes darting between the shadows that hemmed her in. The older woman who had first inspected her had brought food, roasted meat, a coarse bread-like cake, but Clara had touched none of it. Her pride and fear knotted in her stomach, warring with her hunger. Her captor Taza, she had overheard his name, remained close, watching her with unreadable eyes. He did not sit beside her, but neither did he leave her unattended. His presence was like the canyon walls themselves, unyielding, immovable, inescapable. When at last she spoke, her voice was sharp, brittle with exhaustion. You cannot keep me here. Taza tilted his head slightly, his expression calm. He seemed to consider her words as one might consider the cry of a bird, interesting, but not altering the course of his day. I am not your property, Clara pressed on, her voice rising. I belong to myself. Do you understand that? You can't just take me like a prize. For the first time, a flicker of something moved across his face. Amusement? Irritation? She could not tell. He rose to his feet, his height casting her into shadow. Slowly, deliberately, he said, You are strong, you fight. That is why. Her breath caught in her throat. Why what? Why you live? He tapped his chest, then gestured to her. Others. He let the word hang, his hand sweeping outward toward the desert beyond the canyon walls. They die, you live. The bluntness of it stole her words for a moment. She wanted to shout, to argue that survival did not give him the right to claim her, but the conviction in his tone unsettled her. To him, it was not an excuse. It was a law, simple and irrefutable. Clara stood, squaring her shoulders, ignoring the quiver in her knees. I will not be your wife. I will not be your servant. If you think I'll bow to you, you're wrong. The nearby women had paused their grinding, their sewing, their conversations. Curious eyes flicked toward her, their gazes sharp but not unkind. Children peered from behind their mothers' skirts. Clara felt the weight of their scrutiny. She was making herself a spectacle, but her dignity demanded it. Taza's expression remained steady, But his voice dropped lower, firmer. "No, Beau." He shook his head once. Then, with deliberate clarity, "Walk beside." The phrase unsettled her more than if he had demanded obedience. Walk beside, not beneath, not behind. He spoke as though she had been chosen not to be broken, but to endure with him. Clara clenched her fists. "I didn't choose this," she whispered. He regarded her in silence for a long moment. Then, without another word, he turned and left her standing there, the firelight trembling across her face. Clara sank back onto the mat, her chest heaving. Every part of her resisted him, his claim, his calm certainty, the strangeness of this place. Yet beneath her outrage, a small and dangerous seed had been planted. He did not see her as weak. He saw her as worthy, and that terrified her more than anything else. Days passed, and Clara's world bent to the rhythm of the canyon. Morning fires sent smoke curling into the pale sky.
Women moved with steady efficiency, grinding maize, stitching hides, tending to children.
The men came and went in small groups, scouts vanishing into the wilderness at dawn and returning at dusk with game, water, or news. Life here was not chaotic, nor cruel. It was ordered, purposeful, every soul tied to the survival of the whole. At first, Clara kept herself apart, a figure of pale defiance. She refused food until hunger gnawed so hard she could no longer resist. She drank only when thirst scraped her throat raw. She spoke little, keeping her gaze on the canyon rim as though sheer will might lift her beyond it. But the people did not shun her. They watched, they whispered, but they did not harm. Children crept close, bold with curiosity, and when she flinched at their laughter, they only giggled louder. One small girl, no more than 6, shyly pressed a carved wooden doll into Clara's hand before scampering away. Clara stared at it for a long time, confused by the simple kindness. Taza, always near, always watching, never treated her with violence. His restraint baffled her. He had claimed her, yes, had stolen her from the station with a force she could not fight, and yet since then his hand had never struck, his voice never rose in anger. Instead, he gave her space, watching her resist, watching her rage. As though he respected the fire inside her. One morning, he gestured for her to follow him. Clara hesitated, but when he turned and walked away, she trailed after him, unwilling to sit caged while he moved freely. He led her along the canyon's edge, where the air smelled of sage and dust. Stopping, he crouched and pointed at the ground. She saw nothing but sand and scattered stone, but he traced a faint line with his finger hoof prints, barely visible, leading toward a distant ridge. "Dear," he said simply. Clara blanked. "You can see that?" He nodded once, then rose, scanning the horizon. He was silent for a long moment, the wind stirring his hair. Then he handed her a water skin. She hesitated. "This doesn't mean I accept being here." "No," he agreed, his tone calm. "Means you live." She almost shoved it back, pride screaming louder than thirst, but she drank. The cool water, a relief that made her eyes sting. In the days that followed, she saw him in new ways. When a boy fell from a low ridge and scraped his leg, raw, Taza carried him back to camp in his arms, speaking gently to soothe his cries. When a patrol returned with no game, he gave up part of his own portion of food to the elders without ceremony. At night, by firelight, he spoke little, but when he did, the others listened. His voice carried weight not by force, but by the gravity of earned respect. Clara found herself watching when he didn't notice. The strength she had once feared now seemed tempered by discipline, by a dignity she had not expected from the man who had torn her from her world. Still, she reminded herself fiercely, he was her captor. She could not forget that. And yet, when she lay awake at night, staring at the canyon walls, It was not hatred that kept her restless. It was the troubling realization that he had shown her more respect in silence than many men of her own world had in words. That thought unsettled her deeply. The turning point came not in silence, but in fire. It was late afternoon when the first warning shout rang out across the canyon. Clara, seated near the grinding stones with the older women, jerked her head up. Children were rushed into shelters. Dogs barked furiously, and men sprinted for their weapons. The air filled with sudden urgency. Like a storm breaking over still water. Taza appeared almost instantly, his height rising above the flurry, his voice steady and commanding in Apache. Words she did not understand. But she understood the tone. This was no drill, no small danger. Something real and deadly approached. Clara's pulse quickened. She turned her eyes toward the canyon mouth. Soon the sound came, hoofbeats, shouts in English. Riders, soldiers or scouts, she couldn't tell, but their voices carried the harsh confidence of men who believed themselves masters of this land. A gunshot cracked, sharp as a whip. The women flinched, clutching their children closer. Clara froze, her body caught between two worlds. The instincts of the settler, those are my people, and the sight before her of Apache women and children pressed back against stone walls, their fear as raw as her own. Taza strode to her, a bow in one hand, a rifle slung across his back. His eyes locked on hers. "Stay," he ordered, his voice low but fierce. "Safe." He turned to leave, but she caught his arm. "There are children out there still," she cried. She had seen them, two boys dashing toward a shelter on the far side of the camp, panic, slowing their feet. Riders were closing fast. For the first time since her capture, Taza hesitated at her words. His eyes narrowed. Then, with a sharp nod, he sprinted toward the boys. Clara's breath hitched. Instinct drove her before thought could stop her. She ran after him. The ground shook with the thunder of approaching hooves. One rider raised his pistol, sighting the boys. Clara's body moved on its own. She scooped up a stone and hurled it with all her strength. It struck the rider's arm. He cursed, his shot going wild into the canyon wall. Taza was already there, sweeping the boys into his massive arms. He turned, shielding them with his own body, barking orders to the other warriors as arrows whistled through the air. Clara dropped to her knees beside them, her chest heaving, her ears ringing with gunfire. Had chosen. Without thinking, without planning, she had thrown herself into the fray, not for loyalty to Taza, not for acceptance of his claim, but for the lives of the children who had smiled at her, who had slipped her a wooden doll. The fight burned hot and brief. The riders, realizing they had stumbled into more resistance than expected, retreated, their horses pounding away in a cloud of dust. Apache men gave chase, arrows and bullets snapping after them until the sound faded into the distance. Silence returned, broken only by the wails of frightened children and the sharp crackle of burning brush where a stray bullet had sparked flame. Clara's chest hurt with every breath. Her palms were scraped raw, her dress torn. Yet when she looked at Taza, still crouched with the boys in his arms, she saw his gaze fixed firmly on her. There was no mockery in it, no triumph. Only respect, solemn and heavy, as though she had crossed a line neither of them could deny. Clara pressed her hand to her chest, feeling the hammer of her heart. She whispered to herself, hardly daring to believe it, "I helped them." And for the first time since being taken, she did not feel like an outsider looking in. She felt like part of something unwanted, unasked for, but undeniably real. The canyon lay quiet after the fight, but it was not the same silence Clara had first heard upon her arrival. This silence was alive, threaded with the aftermath of danger narrowly escaped. Children clung to their mothers. Men returned in small groups, faces grim but victorious. Fires were stoked higher, both to ward off the chill and to push back the lingering scent of gunpowder that clung to the air. Clara sat apart, her scraped hands resting in her lap. Her body trembled with exhaustion, but her mind refused to be still. She had acted on instinct, risking herself for children who were not hers, for a people who were not her own. And yet when she closed her eyes, she saw the two boys safe in Taza's arms, and her chest swelled with a strange, unfamiliar pride. Taza approached her after the camp settled. His steps were deliberate, unhurried, his tall shadow stretching long in the firelight. He stopped before her, not looming as he had on the day they met, but standing as though waiting for her to look up. She did, though her throat was dry. "You fought," he said. His voice carried no surprise, no question, only recognition. Clara drew in a sharp breath. "I did what anyone would have done." His eyes held hers. In them she saw the truth. Not anyone would have done it. Those men at the station had looked away. They had let her be taken. And she herself might once have stayed still, bound by fear or by the lie of helplessness. But she hadn't. "You are strong," Taza said again, repeating the words he had spoken the night she first defied him. This time they did not sound like a claim. They sounded like respect. Clara's lips trembled, her voice breaking low. "I never asked for this. I never asked to be here." "No," he agreed. His gaze did not falter. "But here," he gestured to the camp, the women laughing again as they reassured their children, the men sharpening arrows by the fire, the old woman stirring a pot with calm patience. "Now you are here." The weight of the canyon seemed to settle on her shoulders. For the first time since being taken, she realized escape no longer lived at the center of her thoughts. Fear, yes. Resistance, yes. But escape? The desert stretched too vast, her ties to the station and her cousin in New Mexico already brittle, fading. The truth pressed against her like the canyon walls. Her life had split, and the path behind her was gone. She drew in a shaking breath. "And if I don't belong?" Taza knelt, lowering himself until his eyes met hers directly. His hand, roughened from years of war and wilderness, rested against the ground between them, open, not reaching for her. "Belong is choice," he said slowly, choosing his English with care, "not chains. Walk beside, not behind." Her heart thudded painfully. Walk beside. The words had unsettled her once, but now they rang with new weight. He had not forced obedience, not crushed her will, only carried her into a world where choices were stripped bare. Made sharper by survival. Clara turned her gaze to the fire, watching the sparks rise and vanish into the dark. She thought of the children's wide eyes, the doll placed shyly in her hands, the boy's cry of relief when Taza had lifted him to safety. She thought of how quickly her hands had thrown that stone, not for herself, but for them. Perhaps belonging was not about where one began, but about where one chose to stand when the world threatened to fall apart. When she looked back at Taza, she did not nod, she did not smile. She simply held his gaze without flinching. And in the stillness between them, that was answer enough. The fire crackled. The canyon breathed around them, and for the first time, Clara felt not only fear, but possibility. A path had opened. Not the one she had planned, but one she would walk now, beside the man who had torn her from the station and carried her into the wild. Her life was no longer borrowed. It was new.